All right, well, thank you all for coming this morning before lunch. This panel is on American nationalism, and it's being sponsored by American Reformer, so I want to say a word about our sponsor before we get into the panel itself. American Reformer was founded in the fall of 2021 as the social and political journal of Protestantism in America. Its executive director and co-founder is Josh Abatoy, and its editor-in-chief is Timon Klein. Timon was originally going to be on this panel, but unfortunately he got sick and couldn't make it today. So the mission of the journal is to promote a vigorous Christian approach to the cultural challenges of our day, rooted in the rich tradition of Protestant social and political thought. Now, American Reformer does many things, including we publish daily articles on the website, americanreformer.org. So go there if you haven't, start reading what we're writing. These articles span a myriad of topics from matters dealing with church polity and political theology and contemporary church scene to commentary on culture, family, and politics in America. So we write lots of articles. Second, there's a weekly podcast hosted by Josh and Timon, where they interview a variety of interesting people. And you can find the podcast on Apple Podcasts and other streaming platforms, or you can listen directly on the American Reformer website. And then finally, American Reformer hosts a summer fellowship, the Cotton Mather Fellowship. I did this in the summer of 2023, and it was very, very good, where a tight-knit group of men, we come together and over the course of the summer, and we do readings in Western and Protestant texts before convening for a retreat at the end of August. So if you don't know much about American Reformer but are interested, go to the website. You'll find everything there. They've even included a widget where you can listen to the articles through AI. So if you don't have time to read them or you're commuting to work, you can listen to an article. So thank you for American Reformer for sponsoring this panel. Now the panel topic is regarding current discussions and concepts of nationalism. After Donald Trump won in 2016, and has now been reelected in 2024, there was a resurgence of talk about American nationalism. This was partly due to Trump's America First platform and policy that sought to reassert American trade dominance with China, energy independence from the Middle East, and financial parity with Europe, and mutual military defense such as NATO. These developments have raised questions about America's status as a nation. Now, of course, most conservatives over the past century wouldn't deny that America is a nation, yet the growth of the liberal international order after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in 1989 and 90, which, for the first time in American history, made America the sole superpower and global hegemon overseeing the economic and military affairs of the world, beating back the jungle of tyranny, anarchy, and fascism. The growth of this liberal international order and America's leadership at its head had done much to weaken and disparage American nationalism. In response to Trump's America First movement, the launch of national conservatism by Yoram Hazony, and the talk of Christian nationalism among the new Christian right, many conservatives raised doubts about the coherence and utility of a resurgent nationalism in America. And some of them arguments went something like this. America is not a nation in the European sense. Nationalism was a 19th century European state-building movement. It was about the construction of national identities out of a people from various estates and villages who spoke different dialects of the same language. America, on the other hand, is a continental empire. Manifest Destiny was not about forming a nation out of a pre-existing sub-region with a shared history, but about conquering and taming the West. America has always been about this, some kind of protean nation, restless, forward-looking, growth-oriented, constantly churning, changing, building. So nationalism is a European thing. It's static, not dynamic, and America is very dynamic. Nationalism is about defining a common identity out of a disparate ethnic and linguistic people group. But America isn't like this. Another common critique is that nationalism is really a code word for a kind of neo-Hegelian, European-style romantic vision of government in which the state, the lo Stato of Machiavelli, becomes an organic, living, and breathing being that makes a people come alive and brings them to completion. This raises the danger of giving over too much power to the national government, losing the ability to check its abuses, or even elevating the state to a divine level, such that whatever the state does, it does by divine providence and the will of God. Or another common disparagement of nationalism is that it's a post-World War II thing. That nationalism has become synonymous with National Socialism, racial purity, and imperial ambitions. Clearly, of course, hearkening back to World War I and World War II. The fear is that what Rusty Reno calls the return of the strong gods, the return of love of one's own, the devotion to religion and morality, and a rejection of pluralism and globalism in favor of one's ethnic kin and the physical land that the people inhabit. This, we are told, will lead to a resurgent Nazism or fascism in America, and this will be the end of the American constitutional order as we've known it. So, this panel will seek to bring historic context and coherence to the idea of American nationalism. Our goal is to find a kind of sensible middle between, on the one hand, a merely historicist and descriptive account of the American nation as she was and now is, and on the other hand, to avoid an overly idealized romantic or abstract account of the mythical nationhood. So our panelists today are three: myself, Clifford Humphrey, and Stephen Wolfe. And I'll introduce the panelists, and then I will go, and then Stephen will go, and then Clifford. Clifford Humphrey is the Executive Vice Chancellor in the Division of Florida Colleges at the Florida Department of Education and the Director of Religious Coalitions at the Edmund Burke Foundation. In 2020, he received a doctorate in political science from Hillsdale College. He went on to found Thales College in Raleigh, North Carolina, and then taught moral philosophy and rhetoric at Troy University in Troy, Alabama. He has written on the topics of classical education, higher education, Christian religion, American politics, and philosophy at various publications, including American Reformer, First Things, American Greatness, The American Spectator, and The Federalist. He is originally from Warm Springs, Georgia. Stephen Wolfe is a country scholar at Wolfshire in central North Carolina, where he lives with his wife and 4 children. He received his PhD in political theory from Louisiana State University. He recently finished a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. Wolfe has written for Mere Orthodoxy, First Things, Chronicle Magazine, and The History of Political Thought. His first book was published in 2022 by Canon Press and was The Case for Christian Nationalism. Myself, Ben Crenshaw. Ben Crenshaw is a visiting assistant professor at the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom at the University of Mississippi, where he teaches courses on the American founding and religion and politics in the Western tradition. He has written for The Public Discourse, The Federalist, The American Mind, and is currently a visiting fellow at American Reformer. He is completing his PhD in politics at Hillsdale College, where he is writing his dissertation on the political thought of Reverend Jonathan Mayhew, a congregational minister in Boston prior to the American Revolution. My talk this morning the title is A Partially Consolidated Confederate and Covenantal Republic, Dual Delegation and American National Sovereignty at the Founding. So my claim in this talk is that America from her founding in 1776 was a nation, and self-consciously so. We don't have to take recourse to 19th century developments in European nationalism to talk about America coherently as being a nation. The founding generation conceived of and talked about America as a nation. However, my argument is also that American nationalism from the beginning was sui generis or unique. And I have 2 major points in this talk. First, I want to talk about nationalism under the law of nations, and then I want to explain America's unique and exceptional form of nationalism. So first, nationalism under the law of nations. American nationalism was conceived of and explained under the law of nations. Now, some of you, probably all of you have heard of the law of nations. What is the law of nations? The law of nations is the natural law applied to the nation state. It is the natural law in the international sphere. As the Swiss jurist Emer de Vattel defined the term in his 1758 book, The Law of Nations, the law of nations is, quote, the science which teaches the rights subsisting between nations or states and the obligations corresponding to those rights. So his definition involves 3 major aspects. First, a nation, Vattel says, is a moral person, quote unquote, created and animated by the united wills of the citizens, and thus each nation has a will and character particular to itself. Now, this is very reminiscent of Montesquieu, who in The Spirit of the Law says that each nation or each form of government has a particular people and spirit unique to it. Now, what exactly a moral person is in society, how it comes to be, whether it is real or artificial, like Hobbes talks about an artificial man in his Leviathan, how it functions and so forth, it's kind of beyond the purview of this talk. These are very important and interesting questions. Second, for Vattel, because a nation is a moral person, the nation has rights and duties under the natural law, and these rights and duties come from God. These rights and duties relate to the nation itself, properly relate the nation to itself and to other nations. Third, for Vattel, the law of nations claims that the highest form of political organization is the nation itself. Thus, and this is very important, in international law, there can be no higher political authority or arbiter between nations that nations can turn to in order to resolve conflicts. This means that under the law of nations, all nations are in a state of nature with all other nations. They lack a common government between them. Now, as an aside, this means the organization of the international political order under what's known as the LIO is very different from the law of nations. Now, why is this? So under the law of nations, what you inevitably have is great power conflict, balance of power politics, a multipolar political order. Whereas the liberal international order tries to create a supra-political body above all the nations that adjudicates between them and brings them under one sovereign head. It attempts to bring them out of the state of nature and into a state of global peace. In addition, under the law of nations, each nation retains the executive power of the state of nature, the right to punish the wrongs of others. But the liberal international order says no nation can act to address wrongs or injustices without approval from the governing bodies, such as the United Nations and its peacekeeping force. Also, the law of nations fosters peace treaties and alliances between nations who have equal and separate stations in the international order, whereas the liberal international order is managed by a world hegemon. And it spurns any kind of official or equal treaties between nations. Nations then become protectorates or client states, buffer and proxy states like Ukraine, for major regional powers or global hegemons. So the liberal international order is a completely different way than the law of nations the founders worked under as in terms of organizing nations internationally. So the point here is that originally conceived and implemented in American constitutional law, American nationalism is not, one, a species of national organization under the liberal international order. Two, it's not an outgrowth and expression of German or Hegelian political thought. And three, nor, as I will explain now, is it merely the same as traditional European nationalism in a kind of post-Westphalian nation-state sense. So this brings me to my second major point, which is that American nationalism takes this unique form of what I call a partially consolidated Confederate and covenantal republic. Now, that's kind of a mouthful, and it's got three parts: a partially consolidated, number one, Confederate, number two, and covenantal republic. So let's talk about each three. First, partially consolidated. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, created a quote-unquote firm league of friendship and a perpetual union among the 13 states. Now, this form of government was a traditional confederation or confederacy, in which you had these independent sovereign republics, the states, compacting together an agreement over a super-republicanism or republican national goal: common defense, common money, criminal law, and so forth. Now, of course, we all know that the Articles failed because its power was dependent upon only the good faith and promises of the states alone. Congress had no real power of enforcement to collect taxes, make states pay back their foreign debt, protect the rights of citizens in the states, and so forth. So the basic insight and argument made by Publius, particularly Alexander Hamilton, in the Federalist Papers is that even in this Republican Confederacy, the states were still basically in a state of nature with each other. There was no common civil or political power over them, all which had genuine authority or capacity of enforcement. So the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 sought to remedy this problem, among many other things. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists agreed that there were three basic options in terms of how these Republican states were going to organize themselves nationally. And these three are outlined by Richard Henry Lee in October 1787 Letters to the Federal Farmer. The first option is a loose confederation of republics, as things were under the Articles. This was the case in which the states retained their full sovereignty and independence as completely distinct political entities. And this is kind of, if you think of a spectrum, this is one extreme over here, a loose confederation of republics. On the other extreme, we have a complete consolidation of the states into a single, monolithic, and bureaucratic national political entity. And in this case, the states are obliterated as independent sovereignties and they become districts of the national power. Now, in the middle, you have a partially consolidated confederate republic. This middle ground is between full state independence and homogeneous national power. This left the states as completely sovereign republics, except for those few matters of common national concern that the states delegated to the national power. So this middle position is what the Constitution took, and what both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists hammered out as being kind of the form of government that comes out of the U.S. Constitution. The states were sovereign over internal police powers, including control over their economic, moral, religious matters, internal taxation, civil and criminal justice, and the like. The states, however, relinquished their sovereignty over foreign policy powers. Each state, yes, had its own militia, but they could not independently raise a navy, declare war, wage war, or make treaties, nor could they oversee international trade or punish piracy. And the states also relinquished control over limited domestic powers. They couldn't mint their own specie, print fiat money, or impose tariffs or duties on other states. The national power was given authority over foreign policy, interstate commerce, in order to create a kind of free trade zone within the United States, a common monetary currency, uniform weights and measures, punishing counterfeiting, regulating bankruptcy, overseeing patents and copyrights, and so forth. All of the domestic national powers are for the sake of promoting and maintaining harmony among the states, meaning the domestic powers given over to the national constitution was for the sake of interstate harmony. Now, this sounds like a lot of power given to the national government, but when you think about the limited objects of Article 1, Section 8, there's actually not much power given to Congress. The original constitutional order left the majority of governance to the state governments. Now, this raises a technical question. By giving up their foreign policy sovereignty, did the states, as independent republics, actually lose their independent sovereignty? Really an interesting question. Perhaps, however, we could use Vattel to say that the core of nationhood is the united wills of the people, which creates a moral person. And the unique character of each of the states and the unity of the American people of each state was not diminished by this partial consolidation of the Confederate States. So that's what I mean by partial consolidation. Second, confederate. The states retained their domestic and police powers, which were considerable. But the national constitutional arrangement that came out of the Philadelphia Convention was not merely a division of power or labor between the federal power, the states on the one hand, and the national powers on the other hand. Madison talks about this at length in Federalist number 39. Instead, the state-national allocation was one of dependency and hierarchy, and we see this in two ways. First, there was a priority of the state republics and their respective governments. As the eminent jurist, Harvard Law professor, and Supreme Court Associate Justice Joseph Story explains in his well-known commentaries on the Constitution of the United States, the national government could neither form nor function without the state governments first existing. This is basically because congressional senators were elected by state legislators prior to the 17th Amendment, and the president was elected by electors from the Electoral College from each of the states. So, no state government, no state republics, no national government. This is what Story has to say. Quote, "The members and officers of the national government have no agency in carrying into effect the state constitutions. The members and officers of the state governments have an essential agency in giving effect to the national constitution. The election of the president and the Senate will depend, in all cases, upon the legislatures of the several states, and in many cases, the election of the House of Representatives may be affected by their agency." Now, Story goes on to talk about even how the very function of the national government in many ways depends upon the states. I won't go off on that. So this means that if you don't have state governments, you don't have a Senate or a president. And since the House can't pass law by itself, no Senate, no Congress. And since the president appoints Supreme Court candidates and the Senate confirms them, no president and no Senate, no judiciary. So, in fact, each of the three branches of the national government are utterly dependent for their very existence on the state governments. This means in the relationship between the national and the federal or state power, the states absolutely take priority. The foundation of our national constitution are the independent state republics. There's more, however. The constitutional scholar Donald Lutz reflected on this phenomenon in his excellent 1988 book, The Origins of American Constitutionalism. And he says this, quote, "I discovered something that writers on American political theory had failed to teach me. There were, in fact, 13 state constitutions in existence in 1787, and they were part of the national document. Referred to directly or by implication more than 50 times in 42 sections of the U.S. Constitution, these state constitutions had to be read in order to understand what the document, the U.S. Constitution, said." So Lutz's point here is profound. The U.S. Constitution presupposes the existence of state constitutions and cannot be understood apart from them. This, in effect, makes the state constitutions, in a way, part of the national constitution. This means that when the U.S. Constitution was fully ratified, 1790, 1791, Rhode Island and Vermont by 1791, the United States was not just governed by the single one U.S. Constitution, but by 14 constitutions. There were 14 constitutions in effect by the time George Washington was elected as our first president. The American people, therefore, were a thoroughly constitutional people. There was no part of American life that was not touched by constitutionalism. The great and large objects of national life entrusted to the national powers, and the everyday domestic matters entrusted to the state powers. Now, what ends up happening is that people think of American constitutionalism at the national scene only. And so they say we have limited government because it's just the national constitution. They forget about the other 13, 14, and now 50 state constitutions that cover all the rest of life. So between the national powers and the state powers, there is an interlocking constitutionalism woven into the fabric of American life and culture. So that was the first point under what I mean by Confederate. Second, in terms of the division of power between the state and the national power being one of dependence and hierarchy, there's also a priority of the people. Publius makes it clear in the Federalist Papers that in a republic, the people are sovereign. The people are the ones who delegate explicit powers to their governments and then elect representatives to govern in those areas and for those objects entrusted to them for the sake of the people. In his 1835 essay on sovereignty, James Madison famously argued that the American constitutional system was one of, quote, dual sovereignty. The states were sovereign in some areas and the national power was sovereign in others, similar to how he had kind of overviewed the division of powers in Federalist 39. So every American citizen, as a citizen of their state and a citizen of the national constitution, they were under two sovereigns. Here I have a slight critique of Madison. While he is correct in substance, in description he is not. It is not that the original constitutional arrangement created two sovereigns for every citizen. This would be problematic. For the very nature of sovereignty is that it cannot be divided. Now, this complaint has sometimes been lodged against Madison and against the constitutional arrangement in general, as assumed to be kind of a fatal flaw in Madison's elaborate political regime. But Madison can be rescued by reconstructing dual sovereignty as dual delegation. The people are sovereign, and the people alone. They rule themselves collectively through the institutions that they created and the political representatives they elected, and they do so by delegating some of those powers to the states and others to the national power. So here's where we come full circle. The possession of this collective sovereignty is only possible when the people are united in their wills and have become a moral person under the law of nations. In other words, American republicanism and constitutionalism require a certain amount of cultural, linguistic, ethnic, moral, and religious homogeneity, exactly what John Jay talks about in Federalist Number 2, in order for them to be united as a moral person and exercise sovereignty as a collective people. Otherwise, they will be fragmented and factious, and they will not be able to exercise their sovereignty. They will cease to be sovereign. So, it is not the case that there are dual sovereigns in America. There is one sovereign, the people collectively. So the people are the sovereign in America, and they delegate their power to their governments, to the state and national powers as conceived and outlined in the U.S. Constitution. Now, there's nothing incoherent about delegating different tasks to separate subordinates. So by reframing dual sovereignty of the national and state powers as dual delegations by an undivided sovereign, I think we can maintain the integrity of our constitutional system while deflecting the worst criticisms. So we talked about partially consolidated, confederate, and now covenantal. The last element of my description of American nationalism is that it's covenantal. For those of you who have studied American political thought, you'll know that the founders believed in and sought to implement social compact theory, very commonly referred to in John Locke's second treatise. Now, that the Declaration and Constitution were social compacts is well known as the state governments. So what's the difference between a compact and a covenant? Perhaps these are, distinction without a difference, or synonyms, or something like that. The basic difference, however, and I'm referring to Donald Lutz and his work on this because it's excellent. The basic difference is that a political covenant is a form of a social compact, except that it acknowledges God as a higher power, and it calls upon this God as a witness and enforcer or guarantee of the compact. So back up. When I talk about covenant, our minds immediately go to the New England Puritans, to the idea of a biblical covenant, or Israel's covenant with God, and to John Winthrop's City on a Hill. It's important to understand that God's covenant with Israel was indeed a political covenant, but not only a political covenant. It also involved every other element of life: religious worship and ceremony, social custom, relations to one's neighbors, eating, drinking, what clothes to wear, and so forth. It was comprehensive over all of life. Yet the kind of political covenant that I'm talking about is not necessarily a covenant between two parties, God and a people, the way Israel's covenant was. Instead, it is a covenant between and among a people under a common God, as the people look to and acknowledge him as their source of life, goodness, and blessings. So most of the colonial charters, constitutions, oaths, compacts, frames of governments were covenantal in nature. They involved the voluntary consent of the adult men of the colony. They stipulated rights and duties, but most importantly, they acknowledged a God above them as being their common God, and they invoked his approval, providence, and especially his witness and guarantee for the things they were promising each other. And this is the critical difference between a compact and a covenant. With a compact, the highest authority is the will of the men involved alone. It is by man's word, and man's word alone, that the compact is legitimate and valid, and of course this runs the danger of a kind of legal positivism. Yet in a covenant, while men's word is important and is registered, there is a divine will involved too. God is invited to partake in the political covenant not as a party to the covenant, but as a judge over the parties involved. So all of the colonial states rewrote their constitutions after 1776. Most of them include an acknowledgement of a divine being, either in articles on religious freedom and the role of religion in political society, in the oaths that they invoke, or other direct references. And some scholars have argued that up to 6 of the 13 states after 1776 actually reestablished religion in some way or another. What about the Declaration of Independence? Is that a covenant or a compact? It's certainly a compact, but I would argue that it's also a covenant. Most people, however, believe that it is a secular Enlightenment document because it was written by Thomas Jefferson. Yet, the document references God 4 times. God is creator, meaning he's the origin of all things. He is nature's God. He is a God as a legislator. He is divine providence. God as executive, and he is supreme judge. God as judge. And in addition, the final paragraph of the Declaration explicitly says that the colonists are, quote, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of their intentions. This is the familiar covenantal element of invoking God for legitimacy as a witness to the rightness of breaking away from Britain and informing their own political community, and as a witness to the promises that they were making to each other. Likewise, the Articles of Confederation invoke the great God of the universe, the great governor of the universe, and speak of him providentially working to bless America and her political endeavors. Now, we come to the Constitution. Of course, the Constitution does not reference God directly, which has led to claims that it is a godless Constitution. And this is a very large topic, and I can't give a lecture on that, even though I'd like to, so I'll just say 2 quick things. First of all, the absence of religious language, explicit religious language, or invocations of God in the Constitution was a concession to necessity, and that there were so many disparate religious sects by this time that would have made it much harder to ratify the Constitution if it had taken a particular religious stance. For example, Quakers would not take oaths. You couldn't even have an oath of a freeman in there or something like that. And second, the Continental Congress commissioned the Declaration and Articles of Confederation to be drafted at the same time. One was a Declaration of Independence and American nationhood. The other was a legal frame or political form of government. So a decent argument can be made that the Declaration and the Articles should be read as a unit, considered as a political unit, and when the Constitution replaced the Articles, now the Declaration and the Constitution should be paired and understood as a coherent American charter. Therefore, there is a reasonable case to be made that the colonists during the Revolutionary and Constitution-making period were still employing the forms, language, and concepts of political covenantalism that they had inherited from their colonial experience. This concludes my case that American nationalism is best understood in terms of being a partially consolidated, confederate, and covenantal republic. Now, I haven't really said much about what a republic is, and I can't get into it, but I'm simply assuming that it's a form of government in which the people are involved in governing themselves for their own good. So in conclusion, I want to say a word about how America's unique national constitutionalism can help make sense of the nationalist movements in America today. Number one, the most important takeaway from my talk is that American nationalism is sui generis. It is totally unique. Of all the nationalisms in the world today or throughout history, none have been like America's, and none ever will be. Therefore, it is simply illegitimate to apply other nationalisms to America. Early modern nation state, 19th century German polity, post-World War II assessments. You must understand America on her own terms. Second, and this is also a critical point, American nationalism simply is American federalism. When those of the new right call for a return to nationalism, this is not some kind of a dog whistle for white nationalism or authoritarianism or rejection of the U.S. Constitution. Instead, it is a call to return to a partially consolidated, confederate, and covenantal republic. It is a call to a disaggregated America, to strengthening local governments, and to refocusing the national powers in Washington on the legitimate ends as spelled out in the Constitution. Third and finally, the desire to return to American nationalism is both a desire to limit government and to expand government. We want to limit government at the national level. We want to return to the national government to its limited objects, but grant Washington the necessary power, the full power and means to achieve those ends. Limited objects, complete power, plenary power. But we also want to reinvigorate the states, to take back the power stolen from them, stolen through doctrines of incorporation and court restrictions, stolen through the growth of power and influence of Washington, the abdication by state legislatures and governors who are more concerned over their self-aggrandizement. So in this way, I think we can have a return to American nationalism that avoids criticisms and the fear-mongering and extremes that we find today and still maintains America as a national constitutional people. Thank you.
I'd first like to thank American Reformer for the panel, and also ISI hosting this is great, so I appreciate it. I'll just get started. So the post-World War II order brought in a new history of America, one that emphasized the U.S. as a nation of immigrants, a nation for anyone who affirms our liberal propositions. But this narrative is false. The post-war period is an era of myth creation, the never-again ethos, which rose to dominate in the aftermath of World War II, required that the political left and political right affirm a new narrative of American history. In the U.S., this story is centered around two seemingly contradictory ideas: that the American political tradition is racist or contains racism, and is marked by radical openness. Both the left and the right accepted versions of these ideas. The left believes that America is racist to its core, a racism that continues to manifest everywhere and explains everything. The left's solution to racism is radical openness through diversity, equity, and inclusion. Similarly, the American center-right will dutifully recognize America's racist heritage, but insist that racism always contradicted America's core ideals, namely the universalistic, radical openness of the American founding. America has improved, according to the center-right, but only by fulfilling the promise of the founding, namely through radical openness, that is, diversity, equality, and inclusion. Thus, both the right and the left are fully committed to radical openness. The left defeats racism through openness, and the right denies American racism with the historical narrative of progressive openness. They differ in their principles, but agree in the means and the ends. Central to this narrative is the idea that America is, at some level, a propositional nation, or at least is a country whose unifying theme transcends ethnic and cultural difference. The greater the diversity, the greater the theme's glory. The more that America looks like the multi-ethnic eschaton, the more marvelous and divine are its principles. This post-war ethos explains why the conservatives in the 1980s sought to universalize or dehistoricize the Pilgrims, making them an archetype of the cosmopolitan, freedom-loving, huddled masses that would come to form our nation of immigrants. Alive and well is the myth that Americans were never a singular ethnos. Any emphasis on identity rooted in intergenerational love for ourselves and our posterity is suppressed and called un-American. It's denounced as nativism. America was never a nation of shared ancestry, blood, and religion, so we're told. Rather, we're told that American unity is a commitment to shared abstract ideals. One belongs by affirming a shared creed. The overarching theme of this America is an altruistic action for humanity, with struggle against various forms of oppression. American identity is a human struggle against the abstract human oppressor. The core American identity is a negative and oppositional identity. Being a good American is simply identifying with and advancing the history of overcoming the oppressor. The chief oppressor, as it turns out in this drama, is none other than the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or to update a bit, the white heterosexual man. He is the villain in every case of oppression in American history. And this is his only distinctive identity in history, that is, as the oppressor, for he cannot have a positive identity, nor can he claim a unique connection to the American Anglo-Protestants of old, such as George Washington. Washington and all great American Anglo-Protestants of our history have been universalized and thus have become fathers of all. We are left with no heroes to call our own. Now, Americans have always been open and welcoming, but until recently, American openness was conditional. It required ethnic conformity. Indeed, American openness was not the toleration of radical difference, as many conceive of it today. It wasn't radical toleration, but radical conformity. Foreigners become natives by becoming like the natives. American openness was the belief that foreigners can assimilate into the American ethnos, namely into Anglo-Protestantism. Contrary to popular belief, there was an ethnic basis to American identity during the founding, which endured well after it, well into the 20th century. There was a dominant ethnicity. Furthermore, solidarity around this unique ethnos was necessary to maintain America's universal principles. Ethnic particularity ensured the survival of these principles. Culture undergirded the viability of the propositions. And this self-confident, dominant Anglo-American ethnos lasted well into the 20th century, and I think at least implicitly persists in American life to this day. At the time of the founding, the American population was 80% British and 98% Protestant. Though there were distinct cultural regions in North America, they were self-consciously American well before even the American founding. Historians Alan Gelzo and Gordon Wood have separately pointed to the Great Awakening as the initial cause of this ethnogenesis, and another researcher, Eric Kaufman, calls it the early stages of, quote, British American self-consciousness. Americans in the founding generation and beyond affirmed a sort of Anglo-Saxonism, linking the American spirit of liberty to the Saxon liberties of old. Thomas Jefferson was the most insistent in this. Americans were, quote, led by Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon chiefs, from whom we claim the honor of being descended, and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. In another place, he wrote, quote, has not every restitution of the ancient Saxon had happy effects? Is it not better now that we return at once into that happy system of our ancestors, the wisest and most perfect ever yet devised by the wit of man, as it stood before the 8th century? This animating myth that Americans were the immigrated remnants of Anglo-Saxons was also articulated by Benjamin Franklin, Charles Carroll, and later by popular 19th century American historians George Bancroft and William Prescott. Anglo-Saxonism is found in the works of Walt Whitman, Henry Adams, Henry Cabot Lodge, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Jack London. Of course, Anglo-Saxonism is more myth than fact, but it speaks to the intertwining of ethnicity, ancestry, and American principles. Now, following the War for Independence, one central question was political unity among the former colonies. As I said, there was a self-conscious Americanness prior to the war, but the war itself completed that unity. Indeed, their mutually shared struggle was appealed to in key times to justify a stronger national government. We all know John Jay's line in Federalist 2. There's also George Washington's 1796 farewell address, where he says this: with slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts, of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. Now, Washington and Jay were not simply stating facts, but arguing for the feasibility of political unity by direct appeal to cultural homogeneity, acknowledging this crucial principle that cultural similarity is necessary for political unity. Affirming universal propositions was not enough. The founders and the American people were not keen on diversity, immigration, ethnic difference. Franklin was famously hostile to the German immigrants and wanted to limit their numbers so to Anglify those who were already there. Thomas Jefferson feared that European immigration would, quote, render America a heterogeneous, incoherent, distracted mass. Ironically for our time, given pop culture, Alexander Hamilton was adamantly against non-Anglo immigration. He writes this: the safety of a republic depends essentially on the energy of a common national sentiment, and on that love of country which will almost invariably be connected with birth, education, and family. Foreigners will generally be apt to bring with them attachments to the persons they have left behind, to the country of their nativity, and to its particular customs and manners. They will also entertain opinions on government congenial with those under which they have lived, or if they should be led hither from a preference to ours, how extremely unlikely is it that they will bring with them that temperate love of liberty so essential to real republicanism. Finally, James Madison spoke of Americans as having a kindred blood, such that they can live together as members of the same family. He wanted to limit immigration only to those who really meant to incorporate into our society. That is, those who will assimilate to the American Anglo-Protestant ethnicity. These founders believed that liberty was made possible by underlying cultural conditions. It is not sufficient to simply affirm universal principles of liberty. For such principles to abide and to produce concrete good in society, the people must be prepared for them. Governor Morris, who was the U.S. ambassador to France in 1792, said this about the French. He said, in effect, time is needful to bring forward slaves to the enjoyment of liberty. Time, education. But what is education? It is not learning. It is more the effect of society on the habits and principles of each individual, forming him at an early period of life to act afterwards the part of a good citizen and contribute in his turn to the formation of others. Hence it results that the progress towards freedom must be slow. So those who lack the requisite culture cannot properly exercise the natural rights. This view is likely the majority position in this country until perhaps 1965, but it lives on unspokenly largely today. For most of our history, there was a core dominant ethnicity that was distinctly American and rooted in Anglo-Protestantism and was confidently dominant in that it demanded the newcomers conform. One fear in the 19th century was this is a quote from Charles Hodge, the great Princeton theologian, about immigration. He said, if it be then the distinction of Anglo-Saxon Christians that they are a Sabbath-keeping people, it is one to be highly prized and sedulously guarded. And in this country especially, we should be watchful lest the influx of immigrants of other nationalities deprive us of this great distinction and its blessing. And we've been deprived. Henry Cabot Lodge would appeal to Anglo-Saxonism among Old Stock Americans to enact the Immigration Act of 1924, which was the law of the land until 1965. For most of our history, Old Stock Americans, which were both the majority of the population and of the elite, believed that American was a distinct ethnicity, or at least contained the core dominant ethnicity of American society, rooted in the Old World, that generated the New World around the time of the founding and early republic. This was not simply the big one among others, but that into which all others ought to assimilate. They rejected the idea of a melting pot, which was cooked up in the early 20th century. The melting pot idea subverts traditional American ethnic openness. Our ancestors believed that the American core ethnos, a people of particular dispositions, manners, and cultural inheritance, is best suited for the sorts of liberties recognized in the American founding. This view animated American politics throughout our history. But we must emphasize that Anglo-Protestantism is traditionally an open ethnicity. We've always held that non-Anglo-Protestants can conform and become fully one of us. Dominant ethnicity is not opposed to assimilation. People of non-British ancestry can become Anglo-Protestant culturally. And we must recognize also that 20th century immigration has overall been bad for the country. Indeed, our sprawling federal bureaucracy, rooted in FDR's New Deal, came largely from the immigrants' preference for the welfare state. Helen Andrews, who wrote this at the American Conservative, says, quote, "The closer we look at the New Deal, the more we see just how deeply entangled immigration is with the growth of the welfare state. Immigrants do not shrug off the values of their ancestral homeland. And those who have, quote, strong family values will still vote for welfare programs and social services over universal moral concerns like abortion and homosexual marriage. When your heart is planted elsewhere, your concern here is for the things of the body." Now, old America, the old right that opposed the New Deal, is not a white thing, but a distinctly American Anglo-Protestant thing, generated on these shores by particular people. I'm not interested in a white nationalism, nor limiting immigration to white people. White immigrants today will likely vote for Democrats. Rather, old America lives on, albeit imperfectly, among white evangelicals, who as a voting bloc are the key bulwark against the complete destruction of old America. Finally, let us recognize that we are a Protestant people. America is a Protestant country. And so Protestants must act as Protestants again. We must be Protestant academics and Protestant politicians and Protestant ethicists and Protestant intellectuals and Protestant voters. We must restore our confident responsibility for the America that is ours. To make America great again, America must be confidently Protestant again. Just to close, I just want to, I'm sure people have seen the video of Justice Scalia when he's in this morning show with a panel. He's with a panel of people. And they're talking about American identity. And of course, this is the Italian, American Justice Scalia. And he's giving a story about him being, spending a semester in Europe. And he spent most of his time in continental Europe, visited France and Italy. And he says near the end of it, he went to England. And upon going to England, he finally, out of all that time he was in Europe, said he felt like home. And I think that shows, again, that one, we are an Anglo-Saxon people culturally, and yet at the same time, people can become that despite their ancestry. And so we are both a particular people and also an open people. But we need to restore that sense of a confident people that will demand and insist that those who do arrive here will conform to them. So thank you.
All right. You'll notice there's a fourth person up here, and I wanted to just explain who that is. This is John Peterson. Because Timon wasn't able to be here, I asked John to step in and offer some reflections and kind of kick off our Q&A. John got his bachelor's from St. John's College in Annapolis and his master's and PhD from UD, University of Dallas, where he taught and was the graduate assistant dean of the Brady Graduate School of Liberal Arts and director of the master's program in classical education and he's now at Hillsdale, where he works as the director of curriculum for the K-12 initiative. He publishes in all the places that start with American, so American Mind, American, so on and so forth. Okay, thank you, John, for stepping in last minute. Before I begin, I wanted to just comment on something that Ben said so I can kind of connect this thought. One of the main points that he made was that in these discussions about nationalism, it's important that the American people are sovereign and that they delegate their power and they're able to dictate their will through their respective state and federal governments. And my paper kind of is on that reflection. Is the American people still effectively sovereign? I wanted to add that when I gave a paper, the first iteration of this conference, and I titled it Beautiful Losers. And I'm happy to report we are now garbage winners. And that actually is important because one could say, after hearing my talk, that, well, the election of Donald Trump proves that everything I'm about to say isn't, that the American people really are sovereign. Look, they just affected their will and in this dramatic way. Doesn't that disprove kind of some of the points I'm making? To which I would just say, I think it's in which Federalist paper it says, Trumpian statesmen are not to be counted on regularly. So we can't count on having Trumpian statesmen at the helm all the time. It's kind of an anomaly that Trump exists now and is able to gather the elective power to be able to be elected in the way that he has. The title that I gave for this talk was The Overly Extended Sphere, ? And if you wanted to add a couple of words to sort of describe it, I would add conditions for politics, nationalism, empire, republicanism, and federalism. My talk kind of is meant to imply certain things for all of those, but predominantly the conditions for politics, and that's the thing that I think is most important. So of all the things that happened at in the American experiment, the founders talked a lot about the novelty of the extended sphere as being one of the most novel things that they themselves understood as experimental. And there's a lot to say from Madison on this, obviously, and I'll get to those, but I wanted to start with a quotation from George Washington in his farewell address of 1796. And I think a lot of people, especially those who love the American founding and who read Madison and the Federalist Papers, we've come to think of the extended sphere theory as something that exists in the abstract, as a principle, and it's true. And if you look at what the founders said, they didn't think of it like that. Madison himself calls it an invention of prudence. And and here's how George Washington says in his farewell address. He asks, and bear in mind the size of the United States in 1796. He says, is there a doubt whether a common government can embrace so large a sphere? And he answers his rhetorical question. He says, let experience solve it. So he doesn't even know at the time. This is something that experience has to solve. So taking George Washington, let's reflect. What has experience taught us about an extended sphere? How has it worked? I wanted to bring in Orrin McIntyre's new book that came out, The Total State, this year. Because he talks about the transformation of republicanism into authoritarianism. And he argues that, quote, the total state is an inevitable consequence of adopting social structures that allowed civilizations to scale well beyond their natural capacity. I know Orrin, and I ask him about some of these terms. What are social structures? What does it mean? What is a natural capacity? I don't know exactly, but I conjecture a little bit. He interprets Robert Conquest's first law of politics, namely that everyone is conservative about that which he knows best, to imply that institutions, this is Orrin, institutions usually have the clearest vision of their purpose at their founding because they're still small enough to stay focused on why they were created. So taking Conquest's law as reflections upon experience, we can see that McIntyre thus answers Washington's query. What has experience taught us about the extended sphere? He answers it in the negative by arguing that it is also inevitable that republics on a large territory will be sustained by adopting social structures that allow for scaling beyond their capacity. So I think about this in a syllogistic form. All institutions that rely on social structures that allow for imprudent scaling will devolve into authoritarianism. All republics that grow too large become so out of a reliance on social structures that allow for imprudent scaling. Conclusion, all republics that are too large will devolve into authoritarianism. So for my talk, I grant the major premise, and I'm going to spend my time really investigating the minor one. Is it the case that all republics that grow too large become so out of a reliance on something called social structures that allow for imprudent scaling? And really, I was looking for a limiting principle somewhere in the American founding, especially in Madison, for how do you know when you become too big? What do you rely on for that? And so that's what I was looking for. And so I focus on Madison, looking at the Federalist Papers, but also his party press essays and some private correspondence to kind of tease out his thinking on all of this. And Madison is explicit in one essay that he wrote, and notes on that essay, that the size of your territory has a definitive effect on the type of regime that you have. You can't just say, I want this kind of regime, and then be large or small, and think that you can have that regime. The size of your regime will have a determinative effect on the kind of regime that you have. So, the Federalist obviously gives a lot of attention to faction and problems therein, and we're all familiar with that. But there's also an equal problem with that, and that's the opposite. And so trying to figure out a dichotomy of what does it look like on the extremes, I think is going to be the way to sort of get at this answer. So early on, Madison focuses on placing a lot of emphasis on like the need for extending the sphere. He says a little bit about, well, we don't want to get too large, but I note that after 1800, and especially after 1803, he doesn't really talk much about it. Those worries that he talks about growing too large seem to go away. And you'll note in 1803, something happened that exploded the size of the territory of the United States, and we'll get there. So, an overly extended sphere, from Madison's own reflections, say, engenders a kind of apathy and an enervation toward political participation in the common good. And so the bold claim that I have is that an apathy and an enervation toward politics and the common good is more perilous today than an overly energetic majority, which was Madison's main concern in the Federalist Papers. So, the first thing I want to do, and this might seem a little odd, but I want to situate Madison's theory of the mean extent, which is what he wants, within a dichotomy that Thucydides describes, as interpreted by Clifford for helping understand a dichotomy. Second, I'm going to go into Madison's very similar dichotomy that Madison has to that, but it's different in a very subtle way that I think is important. If I have more time, I would go into how an extended sphere lends itself to soft despotism in what I think are really interesting ways, but I don't have time for that. And third and finally, I'm going to talk about how the current extensive size of the territory of the United States begs us to reconsider these things and ask, what kind of a regime do we have? And what are the possibilities? Is republicanism possible on an empire scale? Or does that mean we have to sort of change the way that we view republicanism today in self-government? So first, the Thucydidean dichotomy. Clifford focuses on two passages in Thucydides. So in history, there's a lot of just retelling of events and some glorious speeches, but there are a couple times when Thucydides speaks in his own voice and comments on certain things. And two of the most prominent are over the plague in Athens and the revolution in Corcyra, the civil war that happens there. So after describing the symptoms and the origin of the plague that befell Athens in 430 BC, Thucydides turns his analysis to the political effects that the plague had. He talks about the fear of contamination and the general despair caused citizens to abandon their particular folkways and the communal function that those had. Most poignantly, the Athenians began to leave corpses unburied throughout the city, and this was really odd for the particularly religious Athenians to do. Thucydides writes this is the Strasler translation: "As the disaster passed all bounds, men not knowing what was to become of them, became utterly careless of everything, whether sacred or profane. So in addition to becoming apathetic about sacred things, the Athenians also became lawless, unconcerned with preserving honor in the turmoil of the plague. They abandoned religious devotion, civic duty, and personal dignity, and they focused entirely on preserving their bodies and enjoying as much pleasure as they could before joining the ranks of Hades. Thucydides notes this: fear of gods or law of man, there was none to restrain them. So all of this resulted in the complete abandonment of interest in public welfare or common good. It represented, as Orwin calls it, a collapse of politics. It's a kind of depoliticization that can happen. And the distinguishing characteristic of this is an apathy for the city, an apathy for politics, and a total concern for the private. So that's one side of that dichotomy. On the other, in the Revolution of Corcyra, Thucydides describes the really violent civil war that happened there between the democratic and the oligarchic factions that was really grotesque. So it's a longer story, but there's these two factions, the oligarchic and the democratic, and in the end, the democratic faction comes in and just savagely executes all of the oligarchs who resorted to really horrific means of suicide to avoid their ignominious execution. And Orwin notes that among the Civil War, the three pillars of Greek society, kinship, human law, and divine law, were sacrificed to party loyalty. So the citizens of Corcyra forsook respect for the sacred things and the civil laws. The ancient simplicity into which honor so largely entered was laughed down and disappeared. Society became divided into camps, in which no man trusted his fellow who was not a part of his same camp. So this side represents a radicalization of politics, a complete concern with your particular party or faction. So you see the dichotomy there. So we can look now at Madison's definition of faction in Federalist 10, and we can see how this kind of fits in. So he describes a faction as a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority, an oligarchic faction perhaps, or a democratic faction, who are united and actuated by some common impulse or passion, or of interest, averse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent aggregate interests of the community. So, closing thoughts on the Thucydides dichotomy. The pandemonium of both the plague and the revolution, when the common withered away, ceasing to command obedience and even attention, politics becomes impossible in both of those cases. The dichotomy of the two situations involves a radical apathy toward the city on one hand and a fanatical passion for party allegiance on the other. According to Orwin, these poles represent, quote, opposite routes to the disintegration of the city. They are the extremes between which all normal politics lies. So we want that middle ground. We want to avoid both of those extremes. So here's how Madison, moving now to Madison's own dichotomy of this. So the need for the extended sphere. I don't want to go into this because I'm assuming most people here are pretty familiar with Madison's theory, but as he describes it, the main problem that the colonies and then states are facing at the time of the Constitution is a theory of the majority, where we've got people who are overly concerned with their particular thing at the expense of the minority faction. And so what he wants to do is he wants to depoliticize a little bit. He wants to move away from the hyper-politicized pole more towards the middle, towards what Orwin calls normal politics. And the two methods that Madison proposes for that are one, representation, and two, extending the sphere. Skipping this whole passage on Montesquieu, which I don't think I have time for. So representation here is a means of depoliticization. The larger the territory that is encompassed by a republic, the larger that the ratio exists between citizens who are actively involved in political deliberation through rational speech as the representatives, and those who are not. Though citizens are still responsible for choosing their electors, maybe, the connection between the citizens and the political deliberation is gradually and inconspicuously attenuated as the territory expands and as the delegates represent more and more of their constituents. And so now with our House of Representatives fixed at a certain number, every year that the population expands, the ability for citizens to have a more active role in politics in a way disintegrates, slowly and gradually. So that's a depoliticization. And Madison talks about it, equally if you have just too many representatives, you've got just a mob. And even if they were all Socrates, right, they'd still be a mob. So the representation is a way of depoliticizing. According to Madison, though, the extended sphere also reduces the possibility of majority faction by including a greater number of interests as well as increasing the physical space between people with shared interests. The larger the territory, there are more people and a greater diversity of interests. Madison says, extend the sphere, you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. So this device is effective, Madison says, because the natural distrust between men, so separated from each other, and the physical obstacle of having far to travel combine to render cooperative action difficult. So that's another means of depoliticizing. Madison describes representation in a large republic as effective means for maintaining the collective reason of the sovereign people. His hope is that if we depoliticize in this way, what will emerge, right, are the representatives who are able to refine and enlarge the common view, and therefore emphasize the reason of the sovereign people over their passions. So, but Madison also talks about, well, we don't want to get too big. There's problems with getting too big. So how do we keep it small? In Federalist 59, Madison claims the larger the society, provided it lie within a practicable sphere, the more duly capable it will be of self-government. So, okay, so we know it's got to not be impracticable. However, in Federalist 23, Madison kind of complicates this. He explains that if it did prove impossible to maintain republican government in a large republic, then it would prove that we ought to contract our views and resort to the expedient of separate confederacies, the other option that Ben was talking about. And he says, those separate confederacies which will move within more practicable spheres. He uses the same language. So again, we're trying to get at what does this mean, this practicable sphere? How do we even know when we've reached it? And Madison is frustratingly ambiguous on this point. Nevertheless, he gives us some clues. Madison's description of the moderate ratio between electors and delegates is a mathematically necessary consequence that in a gradually expanding republic, delegates must at some point either represent too many constituents or else themselves increase in number to compose a mob within their delegation. Hence, there must be a limit to the size of a republic. We know that. In an overly extended sphere, it must be the case that there are either too many constituents per representative or too many representatives for effective deliberation. In one of his party press essays called Consolidation, Madison stresses the important role that the states play as, quote, local organs through which public opinion is securely conveyed to the federal government. So if we're asking how are the people sovereign, they need to be able to communicate their sovereignty or their will to the government. And they use the states, as he says, as a local organ. He describes the condition of the people that are deprived of such effective local organs this way. He says the impossibility of acting together might be succeeded by the inefficacy of partial expressions of the public mind, and this at length by a universal silence and insensibility, leaving the whole government to that self-directed course which it must be owned, is the natural propensity of every government. He uses the word natural a number of times that I'll try and highlight, but so he says that there's the natural propensity that every government has to be self-directed, not directed by the sovereign people. Okay, another example on Madison talks about the nature of government. So at the Constitutional Convention, Madison gives his first public presentation of his theory of the extended sphere, and Madison writes, taking notes about Roger Sherman's own comments on that. And so he says that the gentleman, Mr. Sherman, had admitted that in a very small state, faction and oppression would prevail. Were we not then admonished to enlarge the sphere as far as the nature of government would admit? Also in Federalist 14, Madison noted that a natural limit to the size of a republic must be recognized based on the practical need and logistical difficulties for representatives to be able to meet together. Third, in a private letter that Madison wrote to Jefferson in October of 1787, just 1 month before Federalist 10 was published, he explains in his most clear way the reasons why Republican territory must be large, yet not too large. He says this: it must be observed, however, that this doctrine can only hold within a sphere of a mean extent. As in too small a sphere, oppressive combinations may be too easily formed against the weaker party, so in too extensive a one, a defensive concert may be rendered too difficult against the oppression of those entrusted with the administration. The great desideratum in government is so to modify the sovereignty as that it may be sufficiently neutral between different parts of the society to control one from invading the rights of another, depoliticized, and at the same time sufficiently controlled itself from setting up an interest adverse to that of the entire society, overly politicized. And then fourth, I think this is my last example here, there's a positive correlation between the size of a political community and the need it has for centralization. Hence, in a small territory, there's less of a need for centralization and greater ability for direct and popular control, so there is a greater possibility for majority tyranny. Likewise, in a large territory where there's greater need for centralization, there's a greater possibility for autocratic tyranny. So in an anonymous essay that he wrote called Notes on the Influence of Extent of Territory on Government, this is clearly something Madison was really thinking about, he writes this, again anonymously. A government of the same structure would operate very differently within a very small territory and a very extensive one. And he uses the British government as an example, or sorry, the size of London. He says, were the British government contracted into the size of London, with the whole territory contracted to the size of London, the monarchy would likely be subverted by the force of popular opinion and feeling. Conversely, if that same government were stretched into a territory the size of China, the extensive size would gradually enable the executive branch of the government to overwhelm the others and convert that government into an absolute monarchy. Consequently, a republic should avoid being too small in order to avoid being unduly controlled by popular faction, and yet it should also avoid growing too large, lest it render the citizenry unable to defend itself from the abuses of an oppressive government. So one subtle difference between Thucydides' dichotomy and Madison's is worthy of note. So in the poles of Madison's dichotomy consist on one hand of a majority that's unfettered from taking abusive action against a minority, and on the other hand, a pole consists of a strong government that represses a supposedly spirited but subdued citizenry. Orwin, so in both of those cases, the will of the people is strong and passionate. In Orwin's dichotomy, though, the people are passionate about only in the hyper-politicized side. In the depoliticized side, they're not passionate at all. They're not even interested in politics. So it comes down to what kind of so in Thucydides, the problem is an apathy towards politics, whereas in Madison, it's the ability, though passionate, to be able to cooperate. I'm not going to go into the Louisiana Purchase part of my paper, but suffice it to say that in 1803, when the Louisiana Purchase happened, Madison has nothing to say about warnings or maybe this isn't a good idea. He's all for it. And he doesn't even say, well, if that necessity requires it, we have to do it. He doesn't. He even actually pushes for the furthest possible extent, not just for the French parts, but for the Spanish parts as well. I'm in Florida now, so I appreciate that. Nevertheless, I find that kind of odd. His concerns seem to go away. There's a few, so we're still trying to tease out what is this practical sphere, what does it mean when we've gotten too large? Madison's clearly aware of it. He leaves a couple of hints, and that's all that we get. He writes about new states coming up within the bosoms of the current states or in their neighborhoods in Federalist 14. You could say, well, if you've got a neighbor and you add one, you add a neighbor, you add a neighbor, you could get all the way to the West Coast and still be consistent with Madisonian principles. Maybe, but I think that's a bit of a stretch from the language. After the Constitution was ratified, Madison discovered a growing sympathy, obviously, for the Republican Party. And in 1791, in one of his, that essay I already mentioned, Notes on the Influence of the State of Government, he mentions two concerns about a republic in an extended sphere. First, he says, and this relates to the Trumpian time that we're in. He says, in a large territory, public opinion is not easily ascertained and is easily counterfeited, both of which he notes favor the authority of government. So there you have it, folks. Trump didn't coin fake news. Counterfeited. That's Madison. He says, in a large territory, public opinion can be counterfeited and make you believe that though you're actually in the majority, that you have a very, dare I say, weird view. Thank you. Another observation he makes in that essay is that the more extensive a country, the more insignificant is each individual in his own eyes, and this also may be unfavorable to liberty. So if you don't know sort of where you stand in the sovereign people, as far as your views go, you're left to, dare I say, large social structures that might suggest to you what your views ought to be, and make you either conform to change your views, or feel like you better not act on your views because you'll be laughed at and mocked, so you might as well just keep them self-censored. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. So, Madison only mentions his concerns about an overly extended sphere in an anonymous essay and in a private letter, and then very loosely in the Federalist Papers. And that's pretty clear, I think, for the reasons that at the time Publius was interested in getting the Constitution ratified on an extended sphere. So he's going to downplay any concerns he would have. He does mention in Federalist 14, though, that technology might actually help overcome the problems of the extended sphere. He says, roads, accommodations for travelers, and the safe use of the eastern seaboard for shipping might help with that. And then in his essay, Public Opinion, he says this: whatever facilitates a general intercourse of sentiments, good roads, domestic commerce, the free press, and particularly a circulation of newspapers throughout the entire body of the people, and representatives going from and returning among every part of them, he says, is equivalent to a contraction of territorial limits and is favorable to liberty, where those may be too extensive. And so through telecommunication technology, through transportation, we can actually overcome the problems of the extended sphere. Here I think is an example, though, of exactly what McIntyre was talking about, I think, about what it means to be reliant on social structures that enable scaling beyond what is prudent. And so, I think about this often in Brave New World Revisited. These are essays that Aldous Huxley wrote a couple decades after Brave New World, was sort of reflecting on things. He mentions Thomas Jefferson and John Stuart Mill as sort of liberals who believed that freedom of the press and newspapers and literacy, this will help guarantee liberty. He says, in regard to propaganda, the early advocates for universal literacy and the free press, and he mentioned Jefferson and Mill, he says, they did not foresee what in fact has happened, above all in our Western capitalist democracies, the development of a vast mass communications industry, concerned in the main neither with the true nor the false, but with the unreal, the more or less irrelevant. In a word, they failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. He didn't even know what Twitter was. So newspapers cannot be a legitimate substitute for political deliberation if either they're filled with irrelevant subject matter or if people simply have no interest in reading them. Because did you see that cat video? Okay, in conclusion, Madison demonstrated his idea of the influence of the extended territory on the government with a hypothetical illustration. He conjectured that if the government of Great Britain, as I already said, if it were stretched to the size of China, then the executive branch would overwhelm the others and convert the government to an absolute monarchy. The fact that the present expanse of the United States is almost identical to the size of China, even in Madison's day, ought to give us great pause. Before we congratulate ourselves for averting totalitarian oppression in America, we ought to ask if by drowning political deliberation in a sea of irrelevance, we are truly as free as we think. Like the other improvements to the science of politics, Madison meant for the extended sphere to be ancillary to the imperfect civic virtue of citizens in order to help them gain what was their true interest, a stable republic within the conditions for normal politics. And this paper contends that unfettered from an intended limit, the territory of the extended sphere becomes a kind of Frankenstein's monster, a product of science that ends up having the capacity to destroy its maker. Thank you. John, do you have a couple of questions for us?
Thank you all for your papers. I just found out I've been participating in this like half an hour before. I get the full paper and just some thoughts. So, is the nation connected to a common language, a common culture? Seems like yes. So part of that common culture seems to be West, what we call Western civilization, right? So how can you retain that as part of Americanism without taking with it this kind of this false idea of a creedal or propositional nation? That is to say that the nation is based on idea rather than a specific people. On the other hand, I noticed the title of the panel is America's Exceptional Nationalism or something. You know, on the other hand, this emphasis on American exceptionalism or Americanism has often been connected to the rejection of the tradition, to the rejection of Western civilization, to the inherited forms of Western civilization. So my work currently is in classical education, where you have conservatives who are saying, well, I don't like what's going on in these modern progressive schools. We need to go back to the good old-fashioned reading, writing, and arithmetic and teaching American patriotism, Pledge of Allegiance. What they don't realize is that's progressive education. That was already progressive education. That was conceived of by people who were trying to replace Western civilization and the inherited forms of the past with a new man, new democratic man, right? The new American citizen. What Clifford was touching on there at the end, a mass popular democracy. What kind of people do you need to have? What kind of education do you need to have? So it's a kind of superficial culture. It's a fake nation. America, in that sense, nationally has a kind of fake national identity, an artificial identity. Does that fakeness or that superficiality go back to the founding? Is the real nationhood at a more local level in the States? I mean, with Ben, your paper, it seems like an extreme presentation of it might be, well, the people, they're sovereign. Insofar as there is a nation on the federal level, I mean, it's entirely artificial. It's entirely a kind of construct. It's not certainly. It's how they affect their will in a certain way, but in terms of what they are as a people, that's really where they can exercise police power locally. So laws like legislating morality, for example, what is the good, that's going to happen locally. So that's what the real nation is. So then there are these distinct nations. So creating the new man, though, creating the new democratic man, unmoored from the past or unburdened from what has been, that seems that's dangerous. That's the citizen subject of the new progressive nation. That has often been connected to the question of assimilation. Even this idea of an American race or an American, a distinct American identity. So how can you talk about American uniqueness or American nationalism or the American nation as exceptional or as a sui generis type of nation while retaining the broad streams of Western civilization, of which the Anglo-Saxon is really only one part? And how can we embrace that tradition, Western civilization, as our own, while not succumbing to this fake nation idea, this path of the creedal of propositional nation? So, I mean, any of your thoughts on these questions? Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share, and feel free to check out one of the recommended videos.